Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. So as you know, my name is Russell Spieth. I'm a licensed psychologist here in Ohio, and I'm joined with Ms. Jessica Zavala. We both oversee the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health. We're so excited that you all came here today. So today's webinar, International Student Mental Health Before and During COVID-19 by Dr. Justin Chen. Jessica and I are in the process of planning for our webinar series for next academic year, which typically starts in September. So please let us know if you have topics that are of interest, and we will try and get folks who are expert in that to speak on it. And it will start in fall. So I missed anything, Jessica, or did I get that?
No, I think you captured everything correctly, Russell. So thank you to everyone for joining us today. My name is Jessica Zavala, and I have the pleasure of introducing our presenter for today, Dr. Justin Chen. He is the Medical Director of Ambulatory Psychiatry Services and Co-Director of Primary Care of Psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital. He is also the Executive Director and co-founder of the nonprofit volunteer-operated MGH Center for Cross-Cultural Student Emotional Wellness. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Justin Chen.
So thank you so much, Dr. Spieth, Jessica, Kay, everyone else who is making this possible. And also I should thank Dr. Michelle Romero from Case Western Reserve University and University Hospitals, who initially had brought me out to Ohio to give a grand rounds actually in January before all this COVID pandemic started. So I've gotten to know the community out there a little bit and just have felt so welcomed and warmly embraced. So I appreciate that. And also excited that there are so many of you all here for this talk. I think it is obviously, I'm biased, but I think it's a very important topic. And so I actually have a very ambitious agenda that I'd like to get through today. So I'll go dive right in. Just in terms of disclosures, I am, as mentioned, the executive director of this program, which is a not-for-profit volunteer-run group that really focuses on the emotional wellness of diverse students. And I don't have any other relevant commercial interest to disclose. So today, I'm going to try to walk you through, just very briefly, for those of you who are not aware of this, the status of international students in the US, just give you a little bit of the statistical and demographic background of that group. Then I'm going to pivot and talk about my passion in life and in my career, which is the role of culture in mental health, just a brief overview. We'll dive even further into specifically the mental health experiences of one particularly large group of students, which is Chinese international students, recognizing that that does not represent all students, but that by learning from their struggles, we may learn something about how to help other international students. And then I'll share a little bit about what we've seen thus far during COVID-19, specifically with regard to the challenges to mental health and stresses that international students face. And then finally end with some more concrete strategies and tools and ideas that you all can bring back to your campuses. Hopefully that sounds good. And you all have the learning objectives, but I do hope that by the end of this, you'll be able to tell someone else about one or two things that you learned. So let's dive right into the background. International students in the US. Many of you, because you're working with so many of them yourselves, are aware that there are a record number of international students in this country. We crossed the 1 million mark a couple of years ago, maybe a few years ago, losing track now. And this number, by the way, includes both those who are actively enrolled in educational programs, as well as those who are in what's called optional practical training, or OPT, which is a period of time anywhere from 1 to 3 years after your educational, formal educational program is over, that you're able to stay in the country, depending on the field of study and the country. So in, the numbers have actually leveled off a little bit over the past few years, but it does continue to climb. And a lot of that growth remains within the OPT realm, and people who are wanting to stay and work. And so here you can see a graph of the way that they've broken it down between undergraduate, graduate, OPT, and non-degree programs. And so you can see that actually it's the OPT that's the fastest growing. But in the green and the blue lines at the very top, it's sort of leveling out, or if not decreasing over the past few years. Where do these students go? It's all over. So probably no surprise that sort of the top destinations are places like New York, California, Massachusetts, but also Texas, Pennsylvania, Illinois. And then Ohio is definitely in the next tier as well. Plenty of students going to Ohio, Virginia, these other states. And then less kind of to further out in the West before you get to the West Coast. And if you look at the fields of study, again, perhaps no surprise, they're really sort of focusing on STEM or the STEM related fields and business and management, and fewer in the humanities. Now, in terms of where the students are coming from, as I mentioned, China is by far and away #1. And what I always emphasize and find remarkable about this is that, 15 years or so ago or 20 years ago, that percentage was much, much lower. It was really only like 5% from China. So with China's economic rise and other factors that we don't have time to get into, the relative proportion of Chinese students has really skyrocketed. But if you can look at just the Asian countries, and if we include Saudi Arabia, sort of Middle Eastern, they really comprise the lion's share of all students. Just between China and India alone, you're at over 50%. So before I go further, I just want to make that disclaimer kind of along the lines of what I said before, which is that Asia is an enormous place, and it's almost nonsensical to talk about Asia as one thing. There's so many different countries and diversity within that continent. Also, when we talk about culture, just to bear in mind that cultural influences are many. And even for those of you who've been in Boston, if you think about the different neighborhoods of Boston, when I'm teaching residents, I talk about how Revere and Charlestown are different cultures than Brookline or Newton. Culture is very complex, multidimensional, and intersectional. It relates to, yes, race and ethnicity, but obviously also a socioeconomic status, religion, spirituality, sexual orientation. All of these could be considered different cultures. So just as a reminder to all of us to not sort of collapse these things. And to bear in mind that even when we talk about Chinese international students, there are so many different factors that influence their sense of personal identity. So that being said, we have to start somewhere. And a lot of our work with the center and my work personally also with patients and clients deals with international students and particularly those from China. And so just to be aware that there are these massive, geopolitical issues that have shaped this generation of students who are coming, most of whom grew up in the period of the one child policy and a period of massive upheaval, social and political upheaval within China, and that there are significant differences that affect their trajectory here in the US. And also that college is a vulnerable transition period for all cultures. I'm saying college, but also international students are coming earlier and earlier and younger, coming for high school, et cetera. So, this is all layered on top of a normal developmental trajectory of any person from any race. I always share this article, which I found really fascinating, from The Economist magazine's 1843. This was an article by a reporter who really did a deep dive into one campus, happened to be the University of Iowa, looking at how the rapid growth of Chinese international students had affected both the Chinese students and also the domestic American students with whom they interacted. And you can see in the subtitle, there was a hope that this flood of students would bring the countries closer. But in reviewing what actually happened, it suggested perhaps anything but that. And this is not a criticism of the University of Iowa. I think, the experiences there were happening everywhere. We've all seen that culture is powerful and it affects the way that people interact and then subsequently their mental health, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So again, I will try to keep this brief, but this is what I've dedicated my career to studying because I think it is so powerful. We like to believe that behavior and medicine are sort of insulated from culture or social issues, but of course they're not. And one way to talk about the power of culture, I find, is to use quotes. And so Peter Drucker is a management consultant, and he was famously quoted as saying, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." Of course, he was not talking about culture like from China or the US, but more culture of a company. But nonetheless, I think the point holds that if you don't kind of understand the way things are done in an organization or in a country or in a society, your best laid plans are probably going to be for naught. There's another one that is apocryphally perhaps attributed to Marshall McLuhan, who said, "Whoever discovered water, it certainly wasn't a fish." And that's the idea that, if we're swimming in it every day, all day long, we actually are not aware of our own culture or our cultural biases. And I think this is very true. Often it's when we travel to a different country that we start to recognize, oh, wow, not everyone in the world does things this way. And finally, this is something I always teach the residents, by the American anthropologist Margaret Mead, who said, never look for a psychological explanation unless every effort to find a cultural one has been exhausted. I just think that is so powerful. It's the idea that we, especially in mental health and psychiatry, tend to pathologize or want to classify and say, well, this type of behavior equals, this syndrome or this diagnosis. And of course, again, we know that's not true because a lot of behaviors are societally dictated. And to prove that, I'm actually going to pivot away from science and talk from the realm of design. So I really love this series of images by the Chinese graphic designer Yang Liu. She lived in Germany, I think, for over a decade and did some studies there. And she kind of tried to illustrate some of the differences in culture that she observed in these kind of like cool, iconic looking images. So this first one is like her interpretation of lifestyle. On the left in blue is Germany, and on the right in red is China, and that's true for all the images. So you can see here lifestyle, she's pointing out the solitary nature or the more individualistic nature of Western countries versus more communal in the East. This is a stereotype that we know well. I like this one about the party. You can see in Germany, they're all clustered in groups of 1, 2, or 3 having little conversations. And then in China, everyone's in a big circle. So perhaps another way of illustrating the same point. Dealing with problems, a bit facetious, perhaps a bit negative, but in the Western view, you just sort of see the problem and you march right through it and solve it, very straightforward. And in the Chinese way, perhaps you wouldn't even acknowledge the problem. You would find a way around it. So it's a little more indirect. And again, I think these are meant to be humorous, but I think they also kind of shed light on certain, cultural influences, we can say, without being stereotyping. This is another very important one, the role of the boss or the teacher, also known as power distance or power difference. In the West, I have a boss, I call him Jeff. We laugh, we joke, we meet a lot. I can email him anytime. It's pretty, we're pretty well related. Whereas I think the stereotype in Eastern cultures is that there's much more of a hierarchy. And I think this is important for educators because students will say, I don't want to go to my teacher. If I talk to my teacher, it means I'm in trouble or there's a problem. That's sort of more the view. And so when we say, go seek help, that may not be necessarily the preferred mechanism for many international students in particular. Just to illustrate that, this is taken from one of my colleagues in Boston, Cynthia Tang, who actually was at Lexington High School and then now lives in Canada. But she had made some observations about just the way classrooms even look in these countries, just as a basic primer. And you can see here the Japanese image, very orderly. There's one focal point in the room. The teacher is sitting up there, everyone's paying attention. And it's just, these are kindergartners, these are 5-year-olds, versus the US version, where there's a totally different emphasis. There's no focal point. In fact, I don't even see a teacher when you look at this carefully. The kids are all kind of more interactive. It's a very different setup. And the hierarchy is a little less clear. This one is relevant to me as a psychiatrist and perhaps to those of you who work in the mental health field, expressing emotions. And so you can see in the left image, the person is sad or angry. The German word says anger, but it's a negative emotion. And the thought matches the face. You can see exactly what this person is feeling. Whereas in the Chinese version, they don't match. Even though he's angry or she's angry, the face is smiling. And I think this is important for us. Again, it's not that one is better or worse, it's that there's differences in emphasis. I think in the West, we have a tradition of emotional catharsis and sort of letting it all out. And in the East, perhaps a little more on emotional inhibition, and that we shouldn't be burdening others with our own reactions to things. Taking that a step further, for those of us who are in mental health fields, I just find this so interesting, thinking about Confucian thought, which has influenced most of many East Asian cultures, and actually including Southeast Asian cultures. Confucius was a famous philosopher who kind of laid down rules that people should follow. And here were two quotes that were really de-emphasizing the role of speech and really emphasizing the role of actions. And so I think, again, to remember when you talk to students that they may not sort of see it as valid or important necessarily to put everything into words or to talk it all out. Whereas I think in the West, we have a little more of an emphasis on those things. So these are all going to come into your interactions with these students. Just quickly, one of the forefathers of the field of cross-cultural psychiatry, Arthur Kleinman, who's also happened to be a psychiatrist and also a trained anthropologist, said, "Psychiatry must learn from anthropology that culture does considerably more than shape illness as an experience. It shapes the very way we conceive of illness." And I think, I very much believe this is true in my work. So now moving on to the next topic, which is specifically so now that we know that culture is going to influence just the way that people behave and what they see as normal or abnormal in terms of the way that we interact and the way we go to a party, the way we talk about our problems. Let's look a little closer at the mental health experiences of Chinese international students. So this is a topic of increasing interest. I mean, I think previously people have known about the mental health struggles of these students forever. I mean, I think there have been international students for decades. I think, I can't remember when the first Chinese student came to the Ivy League, but it was, decades and decades ago. And then in the 1980s and 90s, there were influxes of Japanese students and then Korean students and Taiwanese students and Hong Kong students. So this latest wave of Chinese students is just extending a prior lineage. So I want to make that point. However, because there weren't that many of those students, it really didn't become a focus of research. And now with Chinese students, there's so many. So I think that's part of the reason why there's more and more attention paid. And then of course, the much discussed kind of rivalry between China and the US. I think there's just more awareness of this group of students. Here's on the left an op-ed article in the New York Times written by a graduate student who happened to be studying here in Boston, who wrote about her experiences struggling in the US. And it was a really well-written article. I encourage you to look it up afterwards if you're interested. Again, the slides will be shared, and so you can just Google this. Here on the right also, though, it wasn't just in the US. It was also in Chinese media. So here's a Chinese news website, sohu.com, that was describing the suicide of a Stanford graduate student who was from China. So I think there was a growing recognition that something was going on with these students. And when we break it down, there's a lot that could be said or that is known about the mental health, the stressors that uniquely affect these students. Again, I don't have time to go into all of them, but I will highlight the language anxiety as a major one, just because I don't know how many of you all have studied in a different country or even just traveled abroad, but it's second nature, right? It's that water that we swim in. Having lived in Germany myself for a year, it was really interesting to recognize how the most basic things, I just felt so ill-equipped. And so that's just to go to the grocery store or the post office. And then you start talking about more complex things like maybe visa status or asking for help academically, or even mental health issues, which are hard enough to put into words in your own language, and it gets really challenging. But you can see there's all these other issues that folks face when they come from abroad. And if you want to kind of see it in action, I often, when I'm giving a talk, will play this brief video. It's about 4.5 minutes long, but basically they did a nice thing. They asked these Chinese international students to call home and talk to their parents about some of their struggles. And it's a really illustrative video because not only do they talk about the problems, but you can also see the way that they interact with their parents, which is a major part, I think, of the stressors. And you can see how, even despite the fact it was set up as them sharing their struggles with their parents, there's a real emphasis on not hiding, I should say, more like protecting the parents from worrying. They don't want each other to worry. You can sort of see that dance play out. And so it's a kind of moving video to watch. So I think from a mental health perspective and also from an educator perspective, we should think about the fact that every student and family has different reasons for studying abroad, and they may not always be clear initially. I think we all can recognize that there's obviously a name brand aspect to this of seeing American education as being really excellent and wanting a university degree from here, often taking that. Many of the elites in many of these countries were educated in the West, whether in the US or the UK or elsewhere. And so it's a status symbol. But also, I think some parents do recognize that the Chinese educational system, with its focus on testing and test-based learning, is not the best for every student, and especially for those who might struggle. And so what we may find is that some students who come here actually have undiagnosed learning disabilities or other issues that affected their ability to do well in the Chinese system. Two economists actually coined this term compensation syndrome that I find interesting. Basically, they said that some Chinese parents who felt deprived by the Cultural Revolution of their own educational or economic opportunities basically put tremendous pressure on their students to succeed where they could not, where they didn't have those opportunities. I actually think this may not apply just to China and the Cultural Revolution, but many immigrant parents who basically say, well, I'm going to sacrifice and work really hard so you have these options. And there's something actually really lovely about that, self-sacrificing, but also can be experienced as an incredible burden and additional stressor on these students who basically feel, well, I can't fail because so much is riding on this. Some of our colleagues in China have shared with us cases where it's really a family systems issue. It could be that there was a father usually who had a second family even in China, and essentially is sending away marital problems, sends the original wife and their child to the US to study so that they can be separated. So there could be any number of things going on. And I think over time, it could be helpful to try to understand that and ask. From the student's perspective, I think there was a prior generation where it was really more the student's motivation. I mean, maybe the parents were saying, we think it would be really great. It's a great honor to go study abroad. But I think in the more recent generations, it's been much more the parents' decision to say, well, you're going to go study. The student might be very comfortable living in Beijing or Shanghai or wherever, and then very unhappy to suddenly land in the US. They often may feel left behind by their parents, like their parents don't care about them, and start to wonder about even the role of the family. And do they actually care about me, or do they just care about, what I can do for them? This is, again, clinical insight gained from working with some of these students in our center. Also, there's an interesting issue that sometimes comes up around money, where it's like, well, any problem, like I'm stressed, I'm lonely, I'm anxious, I'm not doing well in school, just send you money. You can sort of buy your way out of it. You can understand the parents' perspective in that, sort of feeling like they're so far away. This is one thing I can do for you. But as we all know, money is not really a substitute kind of for listening or for those more social emotional bonds and feeling lonely, isolated, and bored. So again, I don't have time to go through everything, but it's really can be quite interesting and complex to think about the psychology of cross-culturally students who are studying within a different cultural context. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on these middle two, face and shame and clash of cultures. So I just really want to emphasize, culturally speaking, the role of face is so important. In many, actually, communal societies, it doesn't necessarily have to be Asian, but just to illustrate the foundational role of that in China and other maybe perhaps Confucian societies, I put in some quotes. So this first one, face is the guiding principle of the Chinese mind. Face is 面子 or lian, which basically refers to one's essentially like social standing. And face is probably conceptualized as both you have your own, but also your family would have a shared one. And then the next quote is from Mencius, who is a Confucian scholar, who said, man cannot live without shame. A sense of shame is the beginning of integrity. And this is the idea that shame is actually can be seen as a positive thing. This idea that, we as humans decide how to behave based on a variety of things. And some of them are motivated by our own kind of animal instincts, but some of them may also be through social instincts. And that shame is one way that, in a group, you can sort of regulate what behaviors are considered honorable and which ones are not. And so I think in many of these cultures, shame is not viewed with such a negative connotation as it is perhaps in the West. Also, what I've noticed in working with some of these students is that while there may be positive elements to that, there may also be a dark side, which is this focus on really external achievements or things that you can almost compare. So like, X person goes to this school or, makes this much money. That's, they have very good face or positive face. But it may also contribute to this kind of hiding of problems. And, you only tend to hear about those successful cases, right? The people who made it. And again, this is not unique to Chinese culture by any means. I think we have this in all cultures. But I think it compounds some of these natural instincts that I was describing before of like not wanting to divulge if there's an issue, not wanting to go to an authority figure and mention a problem. Well, same thing here. So then, and also if you only hear the positive things, you never hear about the people who are struggling, then you might feel like I'm the only one, or I'm such a disappointment to my parents. And I think that's something we hear students really struggle with. And interestingly, shame and guilt have been referred to as sort of self-regulatory emotions, meaning that they're emotions that we have that tell us we should not behave a certain way. And some scholars have linked shame more to Eastern cultures and guilt more to Western cultures. And they found that shame is actually more correlated to suicidal thoughts and even attempts than guilt. And the thinking there is that shame is about who you are as a person. It's more totalizing, whereas guilt may be more about, feeling guilty about something you did or didn't do. I mean, not to say you can't become guilty about being a bad person, more totalizing, but there may be a difference there. And so it's concerning for mental health when shame is a dominant regulatory emotion. And then just quickly about the clash of cultures, I think I actually often quote the Tiger Mom, Amy Chua, who famously wrote about the difference between Chinese and American parents in terms of what they consider success. And she said actually that all parents want what's best for their kids, which might be conceptualized as these items in the middle, education, security, et cetera. But there might be a little difference in emphasis. So in the West, I think we have these cultural narratives of following one's dreams, having a lot of independence and making a difference in the world. And then in many Asian cultures, again, not to stereotype, but sort of a way that some students are brought up, it's much more of a focus on stability, sort of obeying your parents or, accepting their sacrifice by doing what they thought was best for you. And again, this sort of focus on impressiveness or saving face for your family. So more about, it's not about you, it's about everyone else. And to illustrate that, I wanted to use this scene from the movie Crazy Rich Asians. There's this great scene where the character on the right is actually a professor of economics at NYU and has this really American story of a single mom who like escaped an abusive relationship and raised her in the US, and she became successful. So she goes home to the old country, Singapore, where she hadn't realized her fiance was incredibly wealthy and has this sort of matriarch of the family, mother, Michelle, played by Michelle Yeoh. And this Constance Wu character on the right has just related her whole story. And she's like, proud of what she and her mother have accomplished. And then Michelle Yeoh's character says, pursuing one's passion, how American. And like immediately that she doesn't think that's a good thing. And you can almost watch the character on the right's kind of heart sinking because she was trying to, I think, be proud and be impressive, but it just shows the clash of cultures again. And probably in the view of the mother sort of thinking, well, there was a lot of complexity going on in her head about, are you really going to be good for my son if what you care about is your own career? And will you be good for this family? So I'll illustrate that again in a second, but I find that sometimes the cultural sayings can be helpful for understanding the way a culture thinks. And so the first one, diligence can make up for lack of intelligence. That is sort of almost completely opposite to some of, we do have the tortoise and the hare story in the West, but I think we also have this narrative around, natural talent and pursuing one's God-given gifts. And so this is a little bit different. This is sort of, work harder and you could do it. And again, I think there's not to say that one is better than the other. I think there's elements of both that could be true. But what I've seen is that for some students, this narrative can be incredibly stressful because they actually don't have another way of understanding not doing well. It's like, well, I could have worked harder. The next one, do not lose at the starting line, is really an admonition to the parents. You can see this is a cartoon from a Chinese newspaper article where all the parents are pushing their toddlers to the starting line. And when I say half jokingly, but also not, that this slide makes me anxious, because I can imagine, sort of thinking like maybe I've already lost before the race has started. And so some of the students may be coming with that feeling of, well, everything is, I need to maximize, optimize. And then finally, again, similar to the Crazy Rich Asians thing, bring honor to your ancestors. This is really not about you as an individual. This is about your family, everyone who came before you and everyone who came after you. And so again, thinking about the pressure that builds up on these students, and with nowhere to go because they're not sharing it with others. So what do we know about the actual psych symptoms? There's not a lot of great literature or data, again, because it's just not been a well-studied group. Here I present some data that I actually cobbled together from several different studies. So you can see on the left, the very far left, the dark purple, this was a study done at Yale University of both undergraduate and graduate Chinese international students with an N of 130, and they just applied sort of general depression screener that's often used in primary care. And then the one on the far right was a similar depression screener that was done in Harbin, China, also of Chinese students, but ones who were living in China. You can see the massive difference. Nearly half of the Chinese students in Yale were experiencing a certain threshold of depressive symptoms, whereas only 12% of the Chinese that were in Harbin were. And then you might say, well, you can't compare those two universities. Yale is a very, elite, exclusive, stressful place, perhaps. But then, interestingly, just this past year, the University of Delaware did another study, and they had almost identical rates. And so it really suggests that the Chinese students who are studying here in the States have a higher rate of distress. And then the two American studies also looked at anxiety symptoms. The Chinese one did not, but one could guess that the rates are also going to be higher in the US than in China. Much more research is needed, and we're actually trying to do some of that in our center right now. So in terms of mental health disparities, first and second generation Asian Americans, including international students, are much less likely to seek mental health treatment. We just know that 2 to 3 times less likely. And in the qualitative studies that have been done, when they do seek help, they're much more likely to rate those services unhelpful. And we'll talk a little bit about why that might be. We actually recently did a study using data from the National College Health Assessment that's done by the American College Health Association. And we looked at Asian Americans. So this is not including, or this did not focus on international students. But what we found was that Asian Pacific Islander students had fewer diagnoses, fewer psychiatric diagnoses, but more concerning psychiatric symptoms and behaviors, including suicidal thoughts and attempts. And so what we concluded from this was that certain minorities, including Asian API and multiracial students, may be of particular concern because they're not coming to attention. They're not getting diagnosed with mental health problems, but they are having these suicidal thoughts. And actually, we just did a follow-up study focusing on international students, the majority of whom were from Asia, no surprise, and it was a very similar finding. They had very low rates of psychiatric diagnosis, but they had elevated rates of suicide attempts. And so that's something we want to follow up and learn more about. There's so many barriers to treatment. Again,
I'll pause you just for a second.
Sure.
Sorry.
Yep.
Yeah, so we got some questions here. So first one, would you prescribe medication for an international student? And there's kind of like a little bit of follow-up. What do you think role culture plays in medication compliance? This person reports that it seems that oftentimes the Chinese national students don't want to take medication and see it as somewhat of a shameful experience and would rather kind of overcome problems on their own. So that was one question, or two, sort of.
Sure, great questions. So yes, I would absolutely prescribe medicine, and I would do it in such a way that takes into account culture. So it's almost never going to work, I would say, I think, unless the person happens to be very acculturated to a Western frame, to say, oh, I've diagnosed you with clinical depression and you need to take this antidepressant, here's the side effects. What I would probably say instead is, I would listen very carefully and then listen to the words the student themselves is using. And this is what we do all the time with patients from any culture, is think about what is their understanding of what's happening and then try to match it and say, okay, so you're not sleeping well, you're not eating well. Sounds like you've been under a ton of stress. And I'll talk about this a little later if we have time, but using the term stress because that's a very cross-culturally acceptable and not stigmatizing concept. And you can even do a bit of psychoeducation about how anyone who is very stressed, or even an animal who is under significant stress and strain, will exhibit similar symptoms. They may be surprised to find that a mouse or a dog would have the same thing. Basically, like kind of something that looks like burnout, right? When you have overwhelming stress, you may know of those studies with mice, they stop swimming. They basically have a lack of engagement, a lack of interest. They stop eating. And so you can just explain to them, this is normal. This is part of human biology. And it's not that stress is a part of life, but it's the combination of stress and your ability to cope with it. And so you can really validate the fact that they're even coming to see you for help, and then say, okay, so you have these things, what do you think is causing it? You have to take this extra time, but if you do, I think it'll be worth it, because if they have more buy-in into like, I think this person kind of gets what's going on. And then you can say, I think I can give you something that'll help with sleep. I think targeting things that are more concrete can be very helpful for these students if they see that, and they also prefer it if it's as needed. So if you can kind of focus, rather than starting them right off the bat on a SSRI or something, you might start with an as needed sleep medication. They're also very concerned about addiction. So just be sure that you address that when you prescribe and say, this is as needed, they'll love that. And then this type of medicine, like try to stick to maybe something that's not a benzodiazepine or something that they could get addicted to. I think that'll be more successful. Again, I'll talk more about that in a bit if that's okay.
Okay.
Another question or?
Yeah, one other. There's a few more, but one for now. What would you recommend in terms of adjusting the expectations of students who believe that diligence will ultimately compensate for a lack of like aptitude, right? So, if it just seems kind of clear that maybe that's not the right path, how would you go about sharing that with a student?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, it's trying to reverse a cultural script, which is very difficult. I mean, think about telling an American student something they believe is it's like lifting the wool from the eyes. So I think, and it's also true sometimes, right? Like that there is a degree to which hard work gets you far. So maybe it'd be more about kind of creating a space where it's okay to talk about that and even question it. I mean, I think it's in a lot of our mental health work, right? It's about developing curiosity and a stance more than kind of giving them an answer. And so maybe just sort of like I've said to patients, wow, I've sort of remarked at the fact that it seems like, well, I talk about how hard they are themselves, because for one thing, it makes them able to observe their own negative critical self-talk, and then sort of reflect on the fact that that seems to be their rubric or metric. Like, wow, can you imagine any situation where you might work really hard and it doesn't work well? And do you think that hard work is the only way that we can measure, or sort of is the only valid way to assess kind of your intentions or your achievement? But it is very difficult just to validate that. I should also mention, because this is so challenging and there's so much nuance to a lot of these conversations, our center has actually already completed filming a set of videos to describe psychotherapy and medication treatment. And it's done by one of our center members who's a clinical psychologist from China, doing sort of a mock intake session with a volunteer who's playing a student who's depressed, all in Mandarin with subtitles in English. And there is a section where they talk about medication. So we were about to launch it, and then COVID happened and we figured it would get lost, but we were figuring out how to best make that available. And if interested, please go to our website, follow us on social media, and we'll definitely be launching that when the time comes. So I'm gonna race through some of this because we've already just talked about it, but I wanna get to some of the more concrete issues for you all about COVID. So again, just to re-emphasize the stigma and shame about mental health that came up in those questions, mental illness is just not understood. This is true throughout the world. There's stigma about it everywhere. When we don't understand, we fear. And there is a specific belief in some parts of Chinese culture that if a family member, let's say my brother had schizophrenia, it would be almost impossible for me to get married because the family now is tainted in that way. Again, with the stigma, like rather than addressing it, that family or that issue is now hidden. And so there's a tremendous effort to hide this, not only from the individual with the mental illness, but also the family. And depression and anxiety, I think, are not viewed necessarily as, I don't think, I think they would be lumped under mental illness, even though it's not the same as schizophrenia, but there's still kind of a suspicion or unfamiliarity and a desire to move away from that. And so as a result, some people who've studied China have said there is more of an emphasis on somatic symptoms like stomach aches or headaches rather than psychological symptoms, because it gets you further when you go seek help. And so as a result, we often see these mental health myths. Counseling is only for crazy people. There's a ton of fear about privacy. And this is something you all can go back and change in your counseling offices and your international student offices. Like, be proactive, I would say, about educating people about this. Like, we take it for granted that there's HIPAA and, you have to sign a release. Often students from other countries don't know that, or it may not even be true in their own context. So just being very clear about the boundaries and, like, everything you say here will be confidential unless there's like a safety concern. And also a concern that if there's a lot of, interestingly, in Asian students, I find worry that if they see someone, they're taking away resources from someone else, even their problems are not big enough. So again, it's a lot of education and validation of they are worthy of treatment. So very briefly, some of the challenges that we've seen during COVID-19 that compound all the ones I already talked about. One of the big questions that students are confronting, do I go home or do I stay in the US? And that's not at all a straightforward question, because there's all these been travel bans, flight cancellations. I think there was a period where the US, I don't know what it is currently, but there was only like something like 1 to 5 flights to China per week, I believe. Someone else can correct me, but it was really limited. It was, people were paying tens of thousands of dollars to try to get out. And then not to mention, you're going to be going home wearing almost full PPE. I've heard this is still happening because I have a colleague who just went back to China, and basically people were wearing like full-on suits and masks for the entire 18 hours or whatever it was, and not eating or drinking. Like the airline was giving out food and drink, but no one was taking it. So a really like traumatic, stressful experience. And we've even had students in high school who had to go back. So that, imagine a 14 or 15-year-old kind of traversing this. Really, really stressful. Then even once they get home, they quarantine for 2 weeks. They often cannot quarantine with their families because they're worried about infecting them. So they have to go to a hotel, and then they have to pay for the hotel. There's stigma. There have been cases of, people in the home country saying, don't come back because we don't want you to reinfect us or cause a second wave. There's been a lot of cancellations of visa appointments in China and India, which is stressing everyone out about, can they come back? Closure of testing centers for those who are thinking about coming to study in the States. So all of these things that I don't think about, and I had to educate myself about, because again, I'm not constantly working in the international education space. So I think the message I want to send is just to be aware that this is a uniquely vulnerable population, just like our lower SES students. There's specific things that the mainstream student doesn't have to worry about. And I think those of us as educators, if we take a moment just to think about, okay, who's going to be most impacted and how can we help? And then also that you have to actually be in the US to apply for that OPT, which again, people are really trying to pursue to stay in the US. So all these stresses are compounding. This was all taken from one of our colleagues, Ruby Chang, University of Colorado, wrote a nice article about this in Inside Higher Ed, if you're interested. Then of course, all of us are struggling with the shift to the new learning environment. And for international students, I think about often housing arrangements are very kind of limited. Maybe they're living in a city where there's very little privacy, hard to find a quiet space to take your classes. There may be challenging family dynamics, as I mentioned, that they're suddenly being dropped right back into. And also when we think about some of our students who may be LGBT or have other things that they were exploring, within an atmosphere of relative freedom in the States, and now they're coming back to the home environment. This is true both for international students and domestic students. The time zone issue is huge. I have patients, it's not so bad, they're in California or Spain, but the one in Spain had to do sort of this crazy reversal of her sleep-wake cycle. And obviously Asia is completely reversed. And the College Board had released a thing saying they were absolutely not changing the time of the AP exams. And so we've gotten questions from our member schools about how would you advise students about taking exams at 2, 4, and 6 a.m. or whatever it was. It's like pretty crazy. And I think some of the students are starting to wonder, and the families, is this really worth the price of admission? Like, we're paying a ton of money, and to do an online school that's going to be held at 3 a.m. I mean, I can understand. The issue of the masks was really interesting. And previously, you may be aware that in Asian countries, it was actually quite common to wear a mask to protect others. And so, but Asians who were wearing masks here as students were looked at with suspicion, especially in the early stages of this. In early March, I remember that was a big issue. And it even made it to the Chinese version of the New York Times to wear a mask or not wear a mask. And then sort of at the end of March, the whole thinking on that changed and shifted. And so I think the students were kind of left head spinning, which is it? And then, of course, that brings us to the very disturbing question of racism. And I'm just giving you examples of racist events that were happening to Chinese or Asian American students, and actually it's not just Asians, whenever there's an event like this that affects a certain minority group, it often spills over and affects all minorities. So it's happening to kids, to teens, to adults. It was covered widely in the media and continues to be. And then there was this whole issue about using phrases like the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus, which continues to perpetuate this linking of disease and foreignness to Asians. And I don't have time to go into this, but this is really nothing new. Like the links between dirtiness and foreignness to Asians is as old as this country, or as old as Asians being in this country. And, as this comedian observed, less than 0.001% of Chinese people have coronavirus, yet more than 99.999% have experienced corona racism. I think that's very true. And so this was a quote from an Asian American studies professor in Boston, which I really liked, because basically he pointed out, this is not like, suddenly this new racism coming out against these people. It was that there's probably prejudices within all of us, to be honest. And then when something like this happens, it's almost like people have permission to act it out or to speak it out. And so just to be aware, but I think it is sort of this awakening for many Asian Americans or Asian international students who may not have considered themselves Asian before. Maybe they'll say, well, I'm Korean or I'm Taiwanese. My family's from Taiwan. I'm not like those Chinese people. But it's, clearly the oppression is intersectional. You can't just disavow it that way. I do wonder if there are maybe some opportunities within the crisis, including the fact that online learning, we can engage wider audiences, just like we are today. Learning more about students' home environments. There's this New York Times article about how, when you're Zooming from your home, you start to see like where are people coming from, which can be hidden when you're all kind of on the same campus. And maybe there are some positive aspects to that. Maybe we can humanize international students more by seeing where they live. Engaging different learning styles. I think some international students who may have a hard time speaking up in class, maybe it's better when they can type in the chat window in Zoom. And then perhaps a growing recognition of racial identity and the shared nature of oppression. And in some of the webinars we've led about racism, I've been so happy to see parents asking explicitly about how do I talk to my kid about this? Again, I'm not happy that they have to talk about it. But I think this is a reality that for a long time we as a model minority have tended to kind of skirt. We don't consider ourselves a minority. We're just, it's all kind of a meritocracy. And we know, of course, that that's not true. The world is not colorblind. It's important to recognize some of these things that may exist. So very quickly, I want to end in 2 minutes so that we can answer some questions, some strategies for addressing international student mental health. This slide is just to say culture change is incredibly hard, and that's what we're talking about when we address this. It's both the students' culture that they bring and also our cultures on campus where we may be set up for a different set of expectations or assumptions. I really want to emphasize that if you have an international office and a counseling office, please meet and talk and have some of those conversations early and mutually embed each other into your orientation activities so that the students recognize that this is part and parcel. And again, I think it's all about normalizing, because it's very easy to say, it's not going to be B, I'm stronger than that, I'm not going to need that. But I think it's helpful if they can see maybe a peer, an older peer who can say, it's really common to struggle when you're here. And I, was sometimes really lonely. And just to make it like, okay, like I think these students are actually desperate for that, but they just don't know how to ask. And so it's up to us, I think, to be more proactive about putting those things in place so that people know that it's okay to talk about. Here's a list of programming that may help. Some of these are borrowed from colleagues that I've given this talk with in the past. Again, you'll have the slides so you can take a look. I sometimes talk about this Football 101 that was done at Appalachian State University, which I thought was really cool. Rather than just teaching the students about football, they actually brought them down to the football field and put them in uniform and made them play a game of touch football with each other and a pizza social afterwards. So it's the idea of bringing people in a different way, like truly inviting them as opposed to just saying like, well, I would say including rather than just inviting. Remember that, as I mentioned, that there may be a difference in symptom emphasis, and so there may be much more of a focus. If the student is having recurrent unexplained physical symptoms, just as we would with anyone from any culture, we would start to wonder about the role of psychological symptoms that are playing out in this way. And then, as I mentioned, we can use this idea of stress and the optimal level and then exceeding that optimal level as a way of bridging the medical culture and the Chinese cultural understanding. I will end by saying you all know much more than you may think. Even if you're not a mental health clinician or clinician, you can use these basic principles of listening, empathy, reflection, and confidentiality, crucially, like helping them to know that you're not going to just go and tell their friends or their parents, and helping make the warm connection to treatment. So I'll just quickly end by saying our center was founded because we discovered this large and growing need, and it's not just for international students, but also other minority students. We're a small nonprofit, even though we're affiliated with a large hospital. We don't get any funding from them. It's all volunteer operated. And we try to put on programming that's going to be useful to the community, including you. So we actually put on a series of 5 webinars recently, and we've done 4 of them. I've put them up here. The 4th one was actually in Mandarin, how the challenges of international students and how parents can be supportive. And these have all been free and open to the public. We also have a consortium that I wanted to share. Some of the people on the call may be part of our consortium, but it's an annual institute where we give monthly educational talks about subjects relevant to you all as educators. And we created a community where we can all help each other. So some testimonials we'll skip, and I'll end there. See if we can answer 1 or 2 questions quickly.
Dr. Chen, that was fantastic. You set presentation goals for me. Okay, so we have a question, and I'll just give you a little bit of a break on this. You know, it's hard to discuss how you'd work with a particular kind of case thrown at you. So just in kind of general, if you were working with a student and their family had a certain expectation in terms of their career goal, and the student themselves wasn't satisfied with that career goal, what are some strategies that you might help them navigate that choice?
You know, it's so funny. That is the actual scenario we chose for that psychotherapy video in Mandarin that I described, because it's so common. So I think, again, like I was saying before, I think it doesn't work to just kind of judge either side of that. I think the students, as much as they may resent their parents, are also probably quite defensive in a way, and not, you know, if they get a sense that you actually are just judging or don't understand it, they will be more likely to shut down. So I would say, just like other types of mental health care, it's creating a space where it's okay to talk about it and wonder about it, and even putting names and words to the student's experience. Like, they may not, it's validating for them. Like, even just to say, wow, it's interesting. Like, so you all disagree about what you want to do. Because for them, it's like pre-conscious. It's just like, well, you know, how can I disagree? But I, you know, and so you're just saying, putting language to it that allows a space where they could discuss it. But it's a huge problem.
Yeah, thank you. There's another question. Just wondering if you know about any research, and again, Africa is just as a complex and heterogeneous continent. But if you know of any research on students coming from Africa, so African international students.
I am not aware of some, but I can definitely go look it up. I mean, I think, I would imagine there's some of the same and some that's very different issues.
And then we have time for one more. So this is the issue where there's a person is saying that Chinese international students have been being accused by professors for academic dishonesty, which this person believes has something to do with racism and xenophobia. How would you help? This is probably a systems issue, but they're kind of asking how you'd help students maybe navigate that. But I guess if you have any kind of systems issues that could maybe help address that issue.
I know some of the schools I've worked with have had to actually do some teaching or education orientation of students about this, because I think there is a difference. Like, I think in some of the Chinese educational system, part of the testing involves actually reciting verbatim large chunks of text. And it's not necessarily seen as plagiarism. It's seen as like, that means you really understand and respect that. Mm-hmm. So there is education that needs to happen about how that's very different here. You need to put quotes, you need to attribute. There is a cultural difference. But that's a complicated question as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think it kind of sounds like, in general, one of the things that you recommended from a systems perspective is really being proactive, right, and trying to get information to employees on campuses as well as students about some of these issues, so that everyone's more aware and therefore know what to expect. Dr. Chen, thank you again so much. That was fantastic. And thank you all for participating. We had a great audience. Thanks for all the questions. Sorry we didn't quite get to all of them. All right. Thank you all. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.